Chapter 16. The good days, the fat days, page upon page of manuscript, prosperous days, something to say, the story of Vera Rivkin, and the pages mounted and I was happy. Fabulous days, the rent paid, still $50 in my wallet. Nothing to do all day and night but write and think of writing. Ah, such sweet days, to see it grow, to worry for it myself, my book, my words, may be important, may be timeless, but mine nevertheless, the indomitable Arturo Bandini, already deep into his first novel. So an evening comes, and what to do with it? My soul so cool from the bath of words, my feet so solid upon the earth. And what are the others doing, the rest of the people in the world? I will go and sit and look at her, Camilla Lopez. It was done. It was like old times, our eyes springing at one another. But she was changed. She was thinner, and her face was unhealthy, with 2 eruptions at each end of her mouth. Polite smiles. I tipped her and she thanked me. I fed the phonograph nickels, played her favorite tunes. She wasn't dancing at her work, and she didn't look at me often the way she used to. Maybe it was Sammy. Maybe she missed the guy. I asked her, "How is he?" A shrug. "All right, I guess." "Don't you see him?" "Oh, sure." "You don't look well." "I feel all right." I got up. "Well, I gotta go. Just dropped in to see how you were getting along." "It was nice of you." "Not at all. Why don't you come and see me?" She smiled. "I might some night." Dear Camilla, you did come finally. You threw pebbles at the window and I pulled you into the room, smelled the whiskey on your breath and puzzled while you sat slightly drunk at my typewriter, giggling while you played with the keyboard. Then you turned to look at me, and I saw your face clearly under the light, the swollen lower lip, the purple and black smudge around your left eye. "Who hit you?" I said. And you answered, "Automobile accident." And I said, "Was Sammy driving the other car?" And you wept, drunk and heartbroken. I could touch you then and not fuss with desire. I could lie beside you on the bed and hold you in my arms and hear you say that Sammy hated you, that you drove out to the desert after work and that he slugged you twice for waking him up at 3 a.m. I said, "But why see him?" "Because I'm in love with him." You got a bottle from your purse and we drank it up. First your turn, then mine. When the bottle was empty, I went down to the drugstore and bought another. A big bottle. All night we wept and we drank, and drunk I could say the things bubbling in my heart. All those swell words, all the clever smiles, similes. Because you were crying for the other guys, and you didn't hear a word I said. But I heard them myself. And Arturo Bandini was pretty good that night, because he was talking to his true love, and it wasn't you. And it wasn't Vera Rivkin either. It was just his true love. But I said some swell things that night, Camilla. Kneeling beside you on the bed, I held your hand and I said, "Ah, Camilla, you lost girl. Open your long fingers and give me back my tired soul. Kiss me with your mouth because I hunger for the bread of a Mexican hill. Breathe the fragrance of lost cities into fevered nostrils, and let me die here, my hand upon the soft contour of your throat, so like the whiteness of some half-forgotten southern shore. Take the longing in those restless eyes and feed it to lonely swallows cruising an autumn cornfield, because I love you, Camilla, and your name is sacred like that of some brave princess who died with a smile for a love that was never returned." I was drunk that night, Camilla, drunk on 78-cent whiskey, and you were drunk on whiskey and grief. I remember that after turning off the lights, naked except for one shoe that baffled me, I held you in my arms and slept at peace in the midst of your sobs, yet annoyed when the hot tears from your eyes dripped upon my lips, and I tasted their saltiness, and thought about that Sammy and his hideous manuscript, that he should strike you, that fool, even his punctuation was bad. When we woke up it was morning, and we were both nauseated, and your swollen lip was more grotesque than ever, and your black eye was now green. You got up, staggered to the washstand, and washed your face. I heard you groan. I watched you dress. I felt your kiss on my forehead as you said goodbye, and that nauseated me too. Then you climbed out the window, and I heard you stagger up the hillside, the grass swishing and little twigs breaking under your uncertain feet. I'm trying to remember it chronologically, winter or spring or summer. They were days without change, good for the night, thanks for the darkness. Otherwise, we would not have known that one day ended and another began. I had 240 pages done, and the end was in sight. The rest was a cruise on smooth water. Then off to Hackmouth it would go. Tra-la, and the agony would begin. It was about that time that we went to Terminal Island, Camilla and I. A man-made island, that place a long finger of earth pointing at Catalina. Earth and canaries and the smell of fish. Brown houses full of Japanese children. Stretches of white sand with wide black pavements running up and down, and the Japanese kids playing football on the streets. She was irritable. She had been drinking too much, and her eyes had that stark old woman's look of a chicken. We parked the car in the broad street and walked 100 yards to the beach. There were rocks at the water's edge, jagged stones swarming with crabs. The crabs were having a tough time of it, because the seagulls were after them, and the seagulls screeched and clawed and fought among themselves. We sat on the sand and watched them, and Camilla said they were so beautiful, those gulls. I hate them, I said. You, she said, you hate everything. Look at them, I said. Why do they pick on those poor crabs? The crabs ain't doing anything. Then why in the hell do they mob them like that? Crabs, she said. Ugh. I hate a seagull, I said. They'll eat anything. The deader, the better. For God's sake, shut up for a change. You always spoil everything. What do I care what they eat? In the street, the little Japanese kids were having a big football game. They were all youngsters under 12. One of them was a pretty good passer. I turned my back on the sea and watched the game. The good passer had flung another into the arms of one of his teammates. I got interested and sat up. Watch the seas, Camilla said. You're supposed to admire beautiful things, you writer. He throws a beautiful pass, I said. The swelling had gone from her lips, but her eye was still discolored. I used to come here all the time, she said, almost every night. With that other writer, I said, that really great writer, that Sammy, the genius. He liked it here. He's a great writer, all right. That story he wrote over your left eye is a masterpiece. He doesn't talk his guts out like you. He knows when to be quiet. The stoop. A fight was brewing between us. I decided to avoid it. I got up and walked towards the kids in the street. She asked where I was going. I'm going to get in the game, I said. She was outraged. With them, she said, those kids? I plowed through the sand. Remember what happened the other night, she said. I turned around. What? Remember how you walked home? That suits me, I said. The bus is safer. The kids wouldn't let me play because the sides were evenly numbered, but they let me referee for a while. Then the good passers team got so far ahead that a change was necessary, so I played on the opposite team. Everybody on our team wanted to be quarterback, and great confusion resulted. They made me play center, and I hated it because I was ineligible to receive passes. Finally, the captain of our team asked me if I knew how to pass, and he gave me a chance in the tailback spot. I completed the pass. It was fun after that. Camilla left almost immediately. We played until darkness and they beat us, but it was close. I took the bus back to Los Angeles. Making resolutions not to see her again was useless. I didn't know from one day to the next. There was a night 2 days after she left me stranded at Terminal Island. I'd been to a picture show. It was after midnight when I went down the old stairway to my room. The door was locked from the inside. As I turned the knob, I heard her call. Just a minute. It's me, Arturo. It was a long minute, 5 times as long as usual. I could hear her scurrying about within the room. I heard the closet door slam. I heard the window being thrown open. I fumbled with the doorknob once more. She opened the door and stood there, breathless, her bosom rising and falling. Her eyes were points of black flame, her cheeks were full of blood, and she seemed alive with intense joy. I stood in a kind of fear at the change, the sudden widening and closing of her lashes, the quick wet smile, the teeth so alive and stringy with bubbled saliva. I said, "What's the idea?" She threw her arms around me. She kissed me with a passion I knew was not genuine. She barred my entrance by a flourish of my affection. She was hiding something from me, keeping me out of my own room as long as she could. Over her shoulder I looked around. I saw the bed with a mark of a head's indentation upon the pillow. Her coat was flung over the chair, and the dresser was strewn with small combs and bobby pins. That was all right. Everything seemed in order except the two small mats at the bedside. They had been moved. That was plain to me, because I liked them in their regular place, where my feet could touch them when I got out of bed in the morning. I pulled her arms away and looked toward the closet door. Suddenly she began to pant excitedly as she backed to the door, standing against it, her arms spread to protect it. "Don't open it, Arturo," she pleaded. "Please." "What the hell is all this?" I said. She shivered. She wet her lips and swallowed. Her eyes filled with tears, and she both smiled and wept. "I'll tell you sometime," she said, "but please don't go in there now, Arturo. You mustn't. Oh, you mustn't, please." "Who's in there?" "Nobody," she almost shouted. "Not a soul." "That isn't it, Arturo. Nobody's been here. But please, please don't open it now. Oh, please." She came toward me, almost stalking, her arms out in an embrace that was yet a protection against my attack on the closet door. She opened her lips and kissed me with a peculiar fervor, a passionate coldness, a voluptuous indifference. I didn't like it. Some part of her was betraying some other part, but I could not find it. I sat on the bed and watched her as she stood between me and that closet door. She was trying so hard to conceal a cynical elation. She was like one who is forced to hide his drunkenness, but the elation was there, impossible to conceal. "You're drunk, Camilla. You shouldn't drink so much." The eagerness with which she acknowledged that indeed she was drunk made me immediately suspicious. There she stood, nodding her head like a spoiled child, a coy, smiling admission. The pouted lips, the look of downcast eyes. I got up and kissed her. She was drunk, but she was not drunk on whiskey or alcohol, because her breath was too sweet for that. I pulled her down on the bed beside me. Her ecstasy swept across her eyes, wave after wave of it. The passionate languor of her arms and fingers searched my throat. She crooned into my hair, her lips against my head. "If you were only him," she whispered. Suddenly she screamed, a piercing shriek that clawed the walls of the room. "Why can't you be him? Oh, Jesus Christ, why can't you?" She began to beat me with her fists, pounding my head with rights and lefts, screaming and scratching in an outburst of madness against the destiny that did not make me her Sammy. I grabbed her wrists, yelled at her to be quiet. I pinned her arms and clamped my hand over her shrieking mouth. She looked out at me with bloated, protruding eyes, struggling for breath. "Not until you promise to keep quiet," I said. She nodded, and I let go. I went to the door and listened for footsteps. She lay on the bed, face down, weeping. I tiptoed toward the closet door. Instinct must have warned her. She swung around on the bed, her face soggy with tears, her eyes like crushed grapes. "You open that door and I'll scream," she said. "I'll scream and scream." I didn't want that. I shrugged. She resumed her face-down position and wept again. In a little while she would cry it off, then I could send her home. But it didn't happen that way. After a half hour she was still crying. I bent over and touched her hair. "What is it you want, Camilla?" "Him," she sobbed. "I want to go see him." "Tonight?" I said. "My God, it's 150 miles. She didn't care if it was 1,000 miles or 1,000,000. She wanted to see him tonight. I told her to go ahead. That was her affair. She had a car. She could drive there in 5 hours. "I want you to come with me," she sobbed. "He doesn't like me. He likes you, though." "Not me," I said. "I'm going to bed." She pleaded with me. She fell on her knees before me, clung to my legs, and looked up at me. She loved him so much. Surely a great writer like myself understood what it was like to love like that. Surely I knew why she couldn't go out there alone, and she touched the injured eye. Sammy wouldn't drive her off. If I were to come with her, he'd be grateful that she had brought me. And then Sammy and I could talk, because there was so much I could show him about writing, and he would be so grateful to me and to her. I looked down at her, gritted my teeth, and tried to resist her arguments, but when she put it that way, it was too much for me. And when I agreed to go, I was crying with her. I helped her to her feet, dried her eyes, smoothed the hair from her face, and felt responsible for her. We tiptoed up the stairs and through the lobby to the street where her car was parked. We drove south and slightly east, each of us taking a turn at the wheel. By dawn, we were in a land of gray desolation, of cactus and sagebrush and Joshua trees, a desert where the sand was scarce and the whole vast plain was pimpled with tumbled rocks and scarred by stumpy little hills. Then we turned off the main highway and entered a wagon trail clogged with boulders and rarely used. The road rose and fell to the rhythm of the listless hills. It was daylight when we came to a region of canyons and steep gulches, 20 miles in the interior of the Mojave Desert. There below us was where Sammy lived, and Camilla pointed to a squat adobe shack planted at the bottom of 3 sharp hills. It was at the very edge of a sandy plain. To the east, the plain spread away infinitely. We were both tired, hammered to exhaustion by the bouncing Ford. It was very cold at that hour. We had to park 200 yards from the house and take a stony path to its door. I led the way. At the door I paused. Inside I could hear a man snoring heavily. Camilla hung back, her arms folded against the sharp cold. I knocked and got a groan in response. I knocked again, and then I heard Sammy's voice. "If that's you, you little... I'll kick your goddamn teeth out." He opened the door, and I saw a face clutched in the persistent fingers of sleep. The eyes gray and dazed, the hair in ruins across his forehead. "Hello, Sammy." "Oh," he said, "I thought it was her." "She's here," I said. "Tell her to screw out of here. I don't want her around." She had retreated to a place against the wall of the hut, and I looked at her and saw her smiling away her embarrassment. The 3 of us were very cold, our jaws chattering. Sammy opened the door wider. "You can come in," he said, "but not her." I stepped inside. It was almost pitch dark, smelling of old underwear and the sleep of a sick body. A feeble light came from a crack in the window, covered by a slice of sacking. Before I could stop him, Sammy had bolted the door. He stood in long underwear. The floor was of dirt, dry and sandy and cold. He yanked the sacking from the window, and the early light tumbled through. Vapors spilled from our mouths in the cold air. "Let her in, Sammy," I said. "What the hell?" "Not that bitch," he said. He stood in long underwear, the knees and elbows capped with the blackness of dirt. He was tall, gaunt, a cadaver of a man tanned almost to blackness. He padded against the hut to a coal stove and began making a fire. His voice changed and became soft when he spoke. "Wrote another story last week," he said. "Think I got a good one this time. Like you to see it." "Sure," I said, "but hell, Sammy, she's a friend of mine." "Bah," he said, "she's no good. Crazy as hell. Cause you nothing but trouble." "Let her in. It's cold out there." He opened the door and pushed his head out. "Hey, you." I heard the girl sob, heard her try to compose herself. "Yes, Sammy?" "Don't stand out there like a fool," he said. "You coming in or not?" She entered like a frightened deer while he went back to the stove. "Thought I told you I didn't want you hanging around here no more," he said. "I brought him," she said. "Arturo. He wanted to talk to you about writing, didn't you, Arturo?" "That's right." She was like a stranger to me. All the fight and glory of her was drained like blood from her veins. She stood off by herself, a creature without spirit or will, her shoulder blades humped, her head drooping as though too heavy for her neck. "You," Sammy said to her, "go get some wood, you." "I'll go," I said. "Let her go," he said. "She knows where it is." I watched her slink out the door. In a while she came back, her arms loaded. She dumped the sticks into a box beside the stove, and without speaking she fed the flames, a stick at a time. Sammy sat on a box across the room, pulling on his socks. He talked incessantly about his stories, a continuous flow of chatter. Camilla stood dismally beside the stove. "You," he said, "make some coffee." She did as she was told, serving us coffee out of 10 cups. Sammy, fresh from sleep, was full of enthusiasm and curiosity. We sat at the fire, and I was tired and sleepy, and the hot stove fire toyed with my heavy lids. Behind us and all around us, Camilla worked. She swept the place out, made up the bed, washed dishes, hung up stray garments, and kept up an incessant activity. The more Sammy talked, the more cordial and personal he became. He was interested in the financial side of writing more than in writing itself. How much did this magazine pay, and how much did that one pay? And he was convinced that only by favoritism were stories sold. You had to have a cousin or a brother or somebody like that in an editor's office before they took one of your stories. It was useless to try to dissuade him, and I didn't try, because I knew that his kind of rationalizing was necessary in view of his sheer inability to write well. Camilla cooked breakfast for us, and we ate from plates on our laps. The fare was fried cornmeal and bacon and eggs. Sammy ate with the peculiar robustness of unhealthy people. After the meal, Camilla gathered the tin plates and washed them. Then she had her own breakfast, seated in a far corner, quiet except for the sound of her fork against the tin plate. All that long morning, Sammy talked. Sammy really didn't need advice about writing. Vaguely through the fog of semi-slumber, I heard him telling me how it should and shouldn't be done. But I was so tired, I begged to be excused. He led me outside to an arbor of palm branches. Now the air was warm and the sun was high. I lay in the hammock and fell asleep, and the last thing I remember was the sight of Camilla bent over a wash tub filled with dark water, and several pairs of underwear and overalls. 6 hours later, she woke me to tell me that it was 2 o'clock and that we had to start back. She was due at the Columbia Buffet. I asked her if she had slept. She shook her head negatively. Her face was a manuscript of misery and exhaustion. I got off the hammock and stood up in the hot desert air. My clothes were soaked in perspiration, but I was rested and refreshed. "Where's the genius?" I said. She nodded toward the hut. I walked toward the door, ducking under a long, heavy clothesline sagging with clean, dry garments. "You did all of that?" I asked. She smiled. It was fun. Deep snores came from the hut. I peeked inside. On the bunk lay Sammy, half naked, his mouth wide open, his arms and legs spread apart. I tiptoed away. "Now's our chance," I said. "Let's go." She entered the hut and quietly walked to where Sammy lay. From the door, I watched her lean over him, study his face and body. Then she bent down, her face near his, as if to kiss him. At that moment, he awoke and their eyes met. He said, "Get out of here." She turned and walked out. We drove back to Los Angeles in complete silence. Even when she let me out at the Alta Loma Hotel, even then we did not speak. But she smiled her thanks and I smiled my sympathy, and she drove away. Already it was dark, a smudge of the pink sunset fading in the west. I went down to my room, yawned, and threw myself on the bed. Lying there, I suddenly remembered the clothes closet. I got up and opened the closet door. Everything seemed as it should. My suits hanging from hooks, my suitcases on the top shelf. But there was no light in the closet. I struck a match and looked down at the floor. In the corner was a burned matchstick and a score of grains of brown stuff, like coarsely ground coffee. I pressed my fingers into the stuff and then tasted it on the end of my tongue. I knew what that was. It was marijuana. I was sure of it, because Benny Cohen had once showed me the stuff to warn me against it. So that's why she had been in here. You had to have an airtight room to smoke marijuana. That explained why the 2 rugs had been moved. She had used them to cover the crack under the door. Camilla was a hophead. I sniffed the closet air, put my nostril against the garments hanging there. The smell was that of burned corn silk. Camilla, the hophead. It was none of my business. But she was Camilla. She had tricked me and scorned me, and she loved somebody else. But she was so beautiful, and I needed her. And I decided to make it my business. I was waiting in her car at 11 that night. "So you're a hophead," I said. "Once in a while," she said, "when I'm tired." "You cut it out," I said. "It's not a habit," she said. "Cut it out anyway." She shrugged. "It doesn't bother me." "Promise me you'll quit." She made a cross over her heart. "Cross my heart and hope to die." but she was talking to Arturo now and not to Sammy. I knew she would not keep the promise. She started the car and drove down Broadway to 8th, then south toward Central Avenue. "Where are we going?" I said. "Wait and see." We drove into the Los Angeles Black Belt. Central Avenue, nightstands, abandoned apartment houses, broken down business houses, the forlorn street poverty and swank for the whites. We stopped under the marquee of a night spot called the Club Soda. Camilla knew the doorman, a giant in a blue uniform with gold buttons. "Business," she said. He grinned, signaled for someone to take his place, and jumped on the running board. It was done like a routine procedure, as though it had been done before. She drove down the corner and continued for 2 streets until we came to an alley. She turned down the alley, switched off the lights, and steered carefully into pitch blackness. We came to some kind of opening and killed the engine. The big guy jumped off the running board and snapped on a flashlight, motioning us to follow. "May I ask just what the hell this is all about?" I said. We entered a door. The guy took the lead. He held Camilla's hand and she held mine. We walked down a long corridor. It was a carpetless, a hardwood floor. Far away, like frightened birds, the echo of our feet floated through the upper floors. We climbed 3 flights of stairs and proceeded the length of another hall. At the end was a door. The guy opened it. Inside was complete darkness. We entered. The room reeked with smoke that could not be seen, and yet it burned like an eyewash. The smoke choked my throat, leaped from my nostrils. In the darkness I swallowed for breath. Then the guy flashed on his light. The beam traveled across the room, a small room. Everywhere were bodies, men and women, perhaps a score of them, lying on the floor and across a bed, and that was only a mattress on springs. I could see their eyes, wide and gray and oyster-like, as the flashlight hit them. And gradually I accustomed myself to the burning smoke and saw tiny red points of light everywhere, for they are all smoking marijuana, quietly in the darkness, and the pungency stabbed my lungs. The big guy cleared the bed of its occupants, flung them like so many sacks of grains to the floor, and the flash spot revealed him digging something from a slot in the mattress. It was a Prince Albert tobacco can. He opened the door and we followed him down the stairs and through the same darkness to the car. He handed the can to Camilla and she gave him $2. We drove him back to his doorman's job and then we continued down Central Avenue into metropolitan Los Angeles. I was speechless. We drove to her place on Temple Street. It was a sick building, a frame place diseased and dying from the sun. She lived in an apartment. There was a Murphy bed, a radio, and dirty blue overstuffed furniture. The carpeted floor was littered with crumbs and dirt, and in the corner sprawled out like one naked lay a movie magazine. There were Coupé dolls standing about, souvenirs of gaudy nights at beach resorts. There was a bicycle in the corner, the flat tires attesting to long disuse. There was a fishing pole in one corner with tangled hooks and line, and there was a shotgun in the other corner, dusty. There was a baseball bat under the divan, and there was a Bible lodged between the cushions of the overstuffed chair. The bed was down, and the sheets were not clean. There was a reproduction of the Blue Boy on one wall and a print of an Indian brave saluting the sky on another. I walked into the kitchen, smelled the garbage in the sink, saw the greasy frying pans on the stove. I opened the Frigidaire and it was empty save for a can of condensed milk and a cube of butter. The icebox door would not close, and that seemed as it should be. I looked into the closet behind the Murphy bed and there were lots of clothes and lots of clothes hooks. But all the clothes were on the floor except a straw hat, and that hung alone, ridiculous up there by itself. So this is where she lived. I smelled it, touched it with my fingers, walked through it with my feet. It was as I had imagined. This was her home. Blindfolded, I could have acknowledged the place, for her odor possessed it. Her fevered, lost existence proclaimed it as part of a hopeless scheme. An apartment on Temple Street, an apartment in Los Angeles. She belonged to the rolling hills, the wide deserts, the high mountains. She would ruin any apartment. She would lay havoc upon any such little prison as this. It was so, ever in my imagination, ever a part of my scheming and thinking about her. This was her home, her ruin, her scattered dream. She threw off her coat and flung herself on the divan. I watched her stare dismally at the ugly carpet. Sitting in the overstuffed chair, I puffed a cigarette and let my eyes wander the profile of her curved back and hips. The dark quarter of that Central Avenue hotel, the sinister guy, the black room and the hopheads, and now the girl who loved a man who hated her. It was all the same cloth, perverse, drugged and fascinating ugliness. Midnight on Temple Street, a can of marijuana between us. She lay there, her long fingers dangling to the carpet, waiting, listless, tired. "Have you tried it?" she asked. "Not me," I said. "Once won't hurt you." "Not me." She sat up, fumbled for the can of marijuana in her purse. She drew out a packet of cigarette papers. She poured a paperful, rolled it, licked it, pinched the ends, and handed it to me. I took it, and yet I said, "Not me." She rolled one for herself. Then she arose and closed the windows, clamped them tightly by their latches. She dragged a blanket off the bed and laid it against the crack of the door. She looked around carefully. She looked at me. She smiled. "Everybody acts different," she said. "Maybe you'll feel sad and cry." "Not me," I said. She lit hers, held the match for mine. "I shouldn't be doing this," I said. "Inhale," she said, "then hold it. Hold it a long time until it hurts, then let it out." "This is bad business," I said. I inhaled it. I held it. I held it a long time until it hurt. Then I let it out. She lay back against the divan and did the same thing. "Sometimes it takes two of them," she said. "It won't affect me," I said. We smoked them down until they burned our fingertips, then I rolled two more. In the middle of the second it began to come, the floating, the wafting away from the earth, the joy and triumph of a man over space, the extraordinary sense of power. I laughed and inhaled again. She lay there, the cold languor of the night before upon her face, the cynical passion. But I was beyond the room, beyond the limits of my flesh, floating in a land of bright moons and blinking stars. I was invincible. I was not myself. I had never been that fellow with his grim happiness, his strange bravery. A lamp on the table beside me, and I picked it up and looked at it and dropped it to the floor. It broke into many pieces. I laughed. She heard the noise, saw the ruin, and laughed too. "What's funny?" I said. She laughed again. I got up, crossed the room, and took her in my arms. They felt terribly strong, and she panted at their crush and desire. I watched her stand and take off her clothes, and somewhere out of an earthly past I remember having seen that face of hers before, that obedience and fear, and I remembered a hut and Sammy telling her to go out and get some wood. It was as I knew it was bound to be sooner or later. She crept into my arms and I laughed at her tears. When it was all gone, the dream of floating towards bursting stars, and the flesh returned to hold my blood in its prosaic channels. When the room returned, the dirty, sordid room, the vacant, meaningless ceiling, the weary, wasted world, I felt nothing but the old sense of guilt, the sense of crime and violation, the sin of destruction. I sat beside her as she lay on the divan. I stared at the carpet. I saw the piece of glass from the broken lamp, and when I got up to walk across the room, I felt the pain, the sharp agony of the flesh of my feet torn by my own weight. It hurt with a deserving pain. My feet were cut when I put on my shoes and walked out of that apartment and into the bright astonishment of the night. Limping, I walked the long road to my room. I thought I would never see Camilo Lopez again.